Hey guys, Britt here. Welcome to End Times Bible Prophecy. Make sure to hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. Well, are we about to see nuclear weapons used on the battlefield for the first time since World War II? Now, we did a video about 2.5 weeks ago on how the United States, it is believed, this isn't publicly available information, but it's believed that the United States sits at DEFCON 3, which is a state of readiness that the United States has only been at a handful of times in its history, and that the United States has been at that point since February 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. So for those who are counting, that's 20 months, which would be the longest period of time that the United States has been at that alert level by far in its history. Again, assuming that's true, and there's no reason to believe that it's not. So we already are in a world that is in a very precarious situation. But then the question becomes, well, what about, that's the United States. What about Israel? As the current conflict with Hamas increase the odds, we will see nuclear war. So I want to turn your attention to this article from Zero Hedge that asks that question. It says, would Israel use its not-so-secret nuclear arsenal if the war expands beyond Gaza? And it says there's a prevailing expectation for the developing war in the Middle East. If Israel commits to a ground invasion, the conflict will expand to the rest of the region. Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Yemen, and others will react with a troop buildup or will engage with Israel outright, even with the presence of 2 U.S. carrier groups. The rhetoric is swirling around what might happen should this chain of dominoes fall, but the most common prediction is that Israel would lose in a multi-front war unless the U.S. forces intercede. And we've heard that bandied about by a number of commentators. They're completely clueless because the Bible makes it very clear that Israel has been brought back into the land, never again to be uprooted. So no doubt about it, we know that Israel will still be around after this conflict. That doesn't mean that they won't, unfortunately, take some losses and be, injured severely. But Israel will not lose this war. But again, reality is different than perception. If Israel's enemies operate under the perception that Israel could lose, then that heightens and increases the risk of escalation and a catastrophic conflict. It goes on, it says, there is, however, another scenario that most analysts rarely, if ever, consider. It's one of the biggest non-secret secrets in the proliferation of armaments. Israel has a nuclear arsenal and has been developing it since the late 1950s. And then it goes on to talk about the history of Israel's nuclear program, what it's believed its capabilities are, when it believes that it might use those weapons. And then it concludes with this. It says, the real question is not if Israel would use nukes, but under what conditions. How bad does the situation have to get before a nuclear response is assured? Given the rhetoric of previous Israeli leaders on defense, it would not take much. A war on more than one front, leading to an uncontrolled breach of Israel's border, could be all the excuse the country needs. And I would take exception with that language. It's not an excuse. If you're talking about an uncontrolled breach of Israel's border with the heightened sense of readiness that Israel has right now, that would mean that its forces were overrun. And so no doubt in my mind, if Israel is overrun at one point or another, whether it's to the north, the south, or the east, they will use everything at their disposal to stop that. And so the question, again, becomes when would they use this? And again, we're looking at a country of about 8,000 square miles. To put that in perspective, you're looking at a country about the size of, say, El Salvador or Belize, or what, the state of New Jersey. We're not talking about a massive country. So again, with all the rockets that are at Hamas's disposal, and Hezbollah, it's believed, has over 150,000 rockets that could launch at Israel, as well as the ground forces to move in and possibly breach Israel's borders. You're looking at the potential. Again, there's only so much size to this country for Israeli forces to retreat into and then expand outward from. So you're looking at a very volatile situation where you could see a very real risk of this happening. And that is exactly the question that Michael Snyder asked on his website, The Most Important News. He says, will Israel use nuclear weapons against Iran and Hezbollah? He says, is it possible that the war in the Middle East could eventually go nuclear? If the fighting could have been limited to just Israel and Hamas, I think that there would have been a 0% chance of Israel using nuclear weapons. And I think that's probably a fair assumption. That's my thoughts. He says, but now it appears that Hezbollah, Syria, Iran, and potentially other parties are likely to get involved too. And that means that Israel will literally be fighting a war of national survival. If it gets to a point where the Israelis think that they could potentially be overrun by their enemies, they aren't going to leave their most powerful weapons on the shelf. And if you aren't familiar with it, I would suggest going and looking up something called the Samson option, which has been talked about for years as Israel's operating principles behind use of its nuclear weapons, meaning if it looks like it will be overrun by its enemies, they will not hesitate to launch nuclear weapons. And even if it means Israel is overthrown, they're going to take down all their enemies as well. Again, the Bible is clear. That will not happen. Israel will not be destroyed or overrun in this conflict. But he goes on. He says, at this point, everyone knows Israel has nukes. According to Wikipedia, it's been estimated that Israel currently possesses somewhere between 80 and 400 warheads, and it appears that some Israeli leaders have been thinking about potentially using this arsenal. When asked about Hezbollah entering the war, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned that the terror group will be hit with a force it cannot even imagine if it does so. Other than using nukes, how could Israel produce such an outcome? Fighting Hezbollah would truly be a nightmare scenario for the Israeli government. Hezbollah possesses at least 130,000 missiles, and they are far more powerful and far more sophisticated than the missiles that Hamas has been using. Can you imagine the horrors that we would witness if thousands of those missiles started raining down on Tel Aviv and Jerusalem? This is not something that Israel wants, but the Israeli government knows that Hezbollah will almost certainly enter the war once the IDF goes into Gaza. And so there had been talk of conducting a preemptive strike to take out those missiles before they could be launched. Then he quotes this article. It says, the Israeli government is coming under growing pressure from security establishment hawks to launch a preemptive strike on Hezbollah in Lebanon, but is facing strong opposition from the United States, which fears a two-front war would risk igniting a major regional conflict. Since Israel struck back at Gaza after the Hamas attack on October 7th, the Lebanese-based Islamist militia group has repeatedly fired on Israeli settlements, leading to an Israeli evacuation of the northern border, including the town of Kiryat Shmona. The threat of a major Hezbollah offensive led to calls from hawks for a strike at its sizable arsenal of missiles. And then Michael Snyder says, of course, if Hezbollah enters the war, it is inevitable that Iran will eventually get directly involved too. And here, I would take exception with this and say, I could be wrong, but I do not think that Iran will directly get involved in this particular conflict. We can talk about why and the dynamics of this, but it doesn't make it any less of a real threat that this conflict will turn nuclear. And the reason I don't think Iran will directly get involved if Hezbollah enters the war, let's think from Iran's perspective. If Hezbollah is given the green light to go ahead, and as these articles mention, Hezbollah is an arm, it is a proxy of Iran. It is trained and funded by Iran. It is supported by Iran in every way. So for all intents and purposes, Hezbollah is Iran. But the reason Iran has trained and funded and built up Hezbollah is precisely to use them as a proxy so that they can claim they weren't involved. It's called plausible deniability. And while you and I and the United States and Israel and others may know, yeah, Hezbollah is Iran, on the world stage, they can win the propaganda war by simply saying, this is some terrorist group, it's not us. And then from Israel's standpoint, what are they? Are they going to go launch an attack on Iran? So here we would have a multi-front war in Israel where they're being attacked by Hezbollah from the north and probably quite a few terrorist groups as well as Hezbollah in pockets of Syria and northern Iraq. It'd be attacked by Hamas from the south and a whole host of terror groups from the east. And so in the middle of this multi-front war, they're going to say, well, Iran was really behind this, so let's open up another front over Iranian airspace. I don't see that happening. Again, I could be wrong. I think the only way that would happen is if the United States was committed to the destruction of Iran if Hezbollah enters this war. I don't think that's the case. So with the current leadership we have, for sure, but we will see what happens. Now, the purpose of this is to understand, is this likely to expand into a nuclear war? And unfortunately, I believe the answer is that the probability of that is very high right now. Extremely high for the reasons we just mentioned. First of all, Iran is behind a lot of this. Iran and its allies, they want to destroy Israel, to wipe Israel from the map. And so what was the purpose of this attack by Hamas? Well, we know what they planned. We know that they didn't expect to succeed to the levels that they did. We know they expected a much bigger response from Israel than what they've received so far. Was this the opening moments of a much greater plan, sort of a trap to draw Israel into attacking with the full weight of its forces going into Gaza so that they would be more vulnerable on other fronts? That very well could be the case, and it's one of the stated reasons many believe we haven't seen this massive ground incursion that's been talked about for 2 weeks now. The other reason we have is hostages. There's ongoing negotiations to release more hostages. Some have been released already. Could more be released if more time goes by in that negotiation process? And of course, there's also the prospect of civilian casualties taking place from this ground incursion into Gaza, and how will that be used against Israel in the worldwide propaganda war? So all of those things work together to cause Israel to maybe delay this ground incursion, but keep in mind, Israel's enemies are also taking advantage of this time for many of the same reasons. They're looking to shore up their vulnerabilities. They're looking to use the hostages as leverage to get concessions for what they want. And they are, there is a very volatile situation right now where we don't know who is plotting what and what's happening behind the scenes. And I would say that this is what we're witnessing right now is a quiet before the storm. And there are several reasons why it's a high probability that this conflict will escalate beyond simply Israel and Hamas. Now, why do I say that? Well, first of all, let's look at what's happened in the last 2.5 weeks. 2.5 weeks ago, the IDF, Mossad, Israeli border security had this air of invincibility. That no longer exists. The success that Hamas achieved in this attack is going to embolden its enemies. It will embolden those who hate Israel and want to destroy it. They'll be saying, Israel is weak and now is the time to strike. We can't back down now. We can't have a ceasefire now. We have to open up additional fronts. You can be sure Iran is thinking that as well. We also have the United States and its air of invincibility. So let's keep in mind, many people have compared this to the attacks of September 11th in the United States. But keep in mind, back then, the United States said, we will go and destroy those who harbor terrorists. We will hunt them down. We declare a war on terror. The Taliban will turn over bin Laden and al-Qaeda, or they will be destroyed. The United States invaded Afghanistan. And here we are, 22 years later. And who is in control of Afghanistan? The Taliban. So to Israel's enemies, they look at that and they say, well, the Taliban won this war against America. The United States doesn't have the stomach. They don't have the will to win this conflict. We can win. And so America's enemies and the Israel's enemies have been emboldened by this. And of course, we see Joe Biden coming out and saying he stands with Israel. But will that continue? Over the weekend, there were several senators from both parties went to Israel, held a press conference, and Senator Richard Blumenthal heard this soundbite on the radio this morning. He said, if Hezbollah is thinking of entering the war, if Israel's enemies are thinking of opening this multi-front war, don't. Right? And this is the same language that Joe Biden has used when he said, if you're thinking of attacking Iran, if you're thinking of entering the war, don't. Right? But the question would be, well, don't or what? So there's no reason for Israel's enemies to believe that this bark is backed up by any sort of bite. They're hearing this, and it's a veiled threat, but they're not going to believe the follow-through. And especially when we look at the success of the propaganda war last week, where much of the media all over the globe blamed Israel for destroying and bombing a hospital in Gaza, and then over time it creeps out, well, it wasn't Israel, it was Hamas or some other entity within Gaza. Oh, and it wasn't a hospital, it was a parking lot. And oh, well, the 500 people we originally said were killed, it's more like 10 to 50. Yeah, so, but in the meantime, tensions all around the world were inflamed, and all of Israel's enemies were emboldened, calling for all of these strikes against Israel. So the longer this goes on, the more the propaganda war can be used, the more weakness is sensed by Israel's enemies, and the more convinced they're going to become that they could win this conflict, that they could overwhelm Israel in an attack. And I think that they will open that multi-front war one way or another, whether it's following a large ground invasion by Israeli forces into Gaza or whether it's something else. They will launch this multi-pronged attack. And that increases the likelihood of Israel using these nuclear weapons because they will not be overwhelmed, guys. So this is something we want to keep paying attention to. Again, I don't know if this is a specific conflict outlined in the Bible or not. We have to wait and see what happens. but it is definitely part of the birth pains we would expect to see in the lead up to the tribulation period, the time of Jacob's trouble, the second coming of Jesus Christ, and of course before that, I believe the rapture of the church. So we'll keep paying attention. Let me know what you think in your comments below. In the meantime, make sure to hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons, and God willing, I will see you on Wednesday. Bye. If you want to learn more about the end times and Bible prophecy, make sure to sign up for my free monthly newsletter and get your copy of my free ebook, 7 Signs of the End Times. Just follow the link in the description to get your free book. Also, make sure to check out all of my books. Just look up Britt on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple iBooks, Google Books, Kobo, or anywhere books are sold. Thanks for watching today, and until next time, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith.